Dr. Ehsan Yarshater is by far the most iconic figure among the older generation of ISIS members and past presidents, and basically he really is the dean and dayan of Iranian studies the world over. Moreover, for the past 30-some years, he has been the editor-in-chief of the Encyclopedia Iranica, itself a brainchild of his, and under his leadership, about 1,500 scholars all around the world that conduct research and teach various facets of Iranian civilization, Persian literature, Iran's history, have come together to contribute entries to this encyclopedia. And Dr. Yarshater, with his global vision, with his most erudite knowledge of the field, is conducting and leading this in such a way as to make the point that Iran is a distinct and distinguishable civilization, that it has played an important part in Islam, in the Middle East, in Western Asia.
We are here to honor the most amazing person, the most remarkable person in Iranian studies. Believe me, Ehsan Yarshater. But I especially wanted to remember the time when a good friend from Columbia by the name of Schuyler Wallace, who was a kind of provost there, when Taqizadeh recommended that Ehsan be appointed as professor at Columbia, he still had some of those old-time beliefs that only a European should fill this chair. And I said to him, look, he's studied with Henning, and I'm sure you will find that he will have not only a first-rate recommendation, but you will never, never be sorry about his appointment, and he certainly never was. Now, one thing, Ehsan and I have fought for quite some time against you people in Southern California the use of Farsi because of the Persian language. And now it's ended, because Tehran has issued in all of the European languages, Persian is the word.
As the first speaker, perhaps it might not be bad if I set the scene for Dr. Yarshater's career, long and fruitful career, before he ever thought about the Encyclopedia Iranica. Since so much attention the past 30-some years have been focused, and rightly so, on his retirement project, the Encyclopedia Iranica, I think the illustrious career before it needs to be somehow resuscitated and looked at, especially because we're talking about this man's contribution to Iranian studies. I have had to revise my own story of Dr. Yarshater's career in my mind several times, because when I first heard him on a radio program called Marzhay Danish talk about the myth of the appearance of language, as well as the scientific approach to how languages may have begun and started outside of the Babel story. I think that was the time, but I thought at the time as a young man that this must be the beginning of Dr. Yarshater's career. Years later, I came across mention of his name many, many years earlier than that. In fact, I think it was a 1945 or 46 letter from Sadiq Hidayat to Hassan Shahid Nourahi, his friend, which mentions Dr. Yarshater among a group of other ulama who have left Iran for Europe. And at that time, Dr. Yarshater must have been 24, 25 years old. And so we have here the case of a man who has been an early bloomer and who has had a long, long, productive life. I think Bungaf Tarjum and Nashr Kitab not only enriched our field, but it also expanded our horizons beyond the boundaries of the modern country of Iran. It was through those publications that we came into contact with Homer in Persian, Goethe in Persian, and various other world literary figures in Persian. These were difficult people for us to read in Persian. let alone we did not know the languages. And as such, that prehistory, if you will, really means how expansive the vision of the young man who started this center was. And mind you, 1954 is the beginning of a great process of estrangement between Iran's intellectual community and Iran's political power structure. The return of the late Shah to Iran and the establishment of a military government and later the establishment of the Sabat and so on and so forth turned a lot of Iranian intellectuals who were groping for various ways of channeling their political energies away from the power structure existing in Iran and towards various ideologies that seemed in their honest groping to oscillate between Marxism and nativism and Islamism and so on and so forth. And you see mentioned in various presentations at this very conference of books like Gharb Zadegi, West-struckness, or Asya dar barabar Gharb, or one can add to the Arzuli Arzishha and so on and so forth, where the groping took a number of disaffected members of the Tudeh Party of Iran away from Marxism and towards various eclectic or maybe puristic visions that somehow had it as their intention to restore the balance between native and foreign in Iranian ideologies. Now, to have a man who steers the middle, who stands there and simply presents ideas for a generation's contemplation, means that cultural work is ultimately far more enduring than political activity, in the sense that it is really that activity that stays with you. Political ideologies come and go. They're transient, they're ephemeral. But when you read something at the age of, let's say, 15, 16, just at the time when your curiosities are being picked, it's a wonderful experience to know that there's all this wealth of knowledge, and to know also that so many international works reflect you back to your own heritage, your own culture. Ahmad Shamlu once said that he had discovered Hafiz through Aragon and various other foreign poets, French poets in this case. There's truth to it. There's often a give and take in your mind as you grow up between the input from outside and the input from inside, and the way the two relate. And I remember the time when I myself was obsessed with people like Frye and Darwin and Marx, these luminaries of the 19th century who defined so much of the early century, which was my immediate context. And in that process, I discovered so much that was located in my heritage that I could gain access to because I had read a book by, let's say, Goethe, the Vestas Divan, in Persian. So I think the service that Bongah Tarjum and Nashr Kitab rendered to my generation was really unique in many ways, and one that only an amazing person with so much foresight can see and offer to one's culture. The text that this Bongah, this center, this organization sponsored and published are amazing. 4 or 5 series, Iranology series, 68 volumes. Persian text series, 48 volumes. Literature for children and young adults, 98 volumes. Foreign literature series, 71 volumes. And general information and knowledge series, 138 volumes. Add them up and you're in the presence of hundreds of books that are added because of one man's contribution. I still see the words Zir Nazar : Ehsan Yarshater. That was a fixture of so many books in the 1950s and 1960s. And then you have the Encyclopedia of Iran and Islam. The Encyclopedia of Iran and Islam, in its own name, it reflects the way Dr. Yarshater sees the interaction constantly between Iran and Islam. Dr. Frye is of the belief that Iranians made Islam, and there's definitely justification for that. I think there are so many Islams, and the Islam that Iranians made is different and is dynamic and is living and is forever changing and changing constellations of ideas and giving constantly ideas. In defining a vision for the Encyclopedia Iranica, Dr. Yarshater charts 3 contexts for the concept of Iran. One is, of course, the world of Islam, and he has written on Iranian Persian services to Islam. There's also the Middle East, the ordinary, the most common, vaster context that Iran is related to. And finally, this whole idea of West Asia, the Persianate cultures, if you will, the subcontinent, Central Asia, Caucasus, Anatolia, and various other contexts in which Iran makes sense. Even in its execution, the Encyclopedia Iranica has really grown in vision. And much as we all sense an emerging impatience with the work to actually come to its conclusion, hopefully in Dr. Yarshater's lifetime, so that he can be the first man to have actually completed an encyclopedia of such a vast scope in his lifetime. And yet, the idea, his decision, for example, to open entries outside of the alphabetic order was a monumental one. It really opened up the Encyclopedia Iranica to all kinds of entries that people can write whose lives may not be guaranteed for the foreseeable future. And as such, it is a combination of expanding an expansive vision, boundless energy, and an amazing personality that makes the Encyclopedia Iranica possible. But I meant, and I hope I took some steps in that direction, to shed a little light on what prepared Dr. Yarshater for take the final step in 1972, 1973 to move into the Encyclopedia Iranica. The labor from there to here, these 36, 7, 8 years, has been really consuming in all sorts of ways. But I think my other colleagues, Oktor Skjaervo has had years with the Encyclopedia Iranica, and others will deal with that. Thank you very much.
It was only in 1984, after I had decided I wanted to move to America, that I got in touch with him about becoming a senior or assistant editor of the encyclopedia. He asked around among our colleagues whether they thought I was appropriate for it, and he then took me, and I came there in 1985. It was well known at the time, of course, that the lifetime of senior assistant editors at the encyclopedia was very short. But I thought, you know, being a stubborn Norwegian, just like this stubborn Swede, I thought I'd take the chance. So I came there in 1985. And I stayed for 6 years, which is probably longer than all of my preceding editors altogether. When I got the chair at Harvard as Dick Frye's successor. Those were, from what Professor Karimi-Hakkak told you, the encyclopedia project was it was an overwhelming project. It was very hard. It was very hard work. It was hard work for the editor. It was very hard work for us, the assistant editors. And we had ups and downs. We were at times very upset. He was at times very upset that we didn't publish faster. He was upset at the publishers, and rightly so. But I must say, looking back at what it gave me in later years, it was such an fabulous, it was just such an enormous opportunity for me. What it did was it put this totally, almost unknown Norwegian Norwegian in the middle of the map of Iranian studies. I would go to conferences and people would come and say, "Oh, I owe you an article, please excuse me." So I got known for good or for bad. And not only that, the encyclopedia opened up a perspective onto Iranian studies, which I would never have had if I hadn't been there. I learned about literature, I learned about art, architecture, archaeology. I was just basically doing languages, but I came out of the encyclopedia after 6 years knowing probably more, almost as much as my predecessor, Richard Frye, about Iranian studies in general. There were good times and there were bad times. We had some very bad times. I remember one thing that really hurt us all very much was when Dr. Frye passed away. Really all of us. She was a presence, and we sort of sensed how she really kept him going and held him up. And we thought that was very terrible. Also, my successor, Estelle Whalen, who saw most of the Tabari project through, who died of cancer 7 years after having been assistant editor for 7 years at the encyclopedia. But looking back at the project itself and its editor, it's a fabulous project. Even if I was upset at some of the articles, we had some extremely good articles, we had very many good articles, we had mediocre articles and we had bad articles. I thought the good articles and the excellent articles were worth all the work and keeping everything. And what he's doing now, of course, putting everything online, is just, it's so modern and it's so useful, and I hope you have all explored the new site, which is so fabulous. Much of this area was covered by Dr. Yarshater in his book, and subsequent publications of other dialects in these areas completely changed our knowledge of the dialect geography of all of Western Iran. He wrote an overview of the area, in particular the Tati dialects, for the Encyclopedia Iranica under the entry Azerbaijan and the ancient language, Azeri, the ancient language of Azerbaijan. As it happened, this was one of the first articles I edited for the encyclopedia, which was in my own field, more or less, when I came to the center in 1985. One of the principal assumptions in this article was that the Tati dialects were descendants of the ancient Median language spoken in the north and central western Iran in the Achaemenid period, which is, the Medes are described by Herodotus, as you remember, and other Greek historians. Personally, I didn't feel that this could be stated quite so forcefully, thinking that there must have been other languages besides Median that nobody talked about in the ancient times. So the fact that they may have been, these dialects were Median, I didn't quite agree with that. So I kept fiddling with the article and sort of took out a little bit of the strong statements of Dr. Yarshater and sort of modified it a bit. My efforts were in vain. If anything, I think the statement was stated even more forcefully after I had sort of toned it down. So today it reads more or less like this, and it's interesting because it's one of his favorite ideas and theories about the linguistic atlas of Iran. He says, Azerbaijan and the Jebal of the medieval geography, that is, the mountainous west-central part of the Iranian plateau, coincided geographically with ancient Media and was inhabited by Median tribes in ancient times. Although no independent written document in ancient Median has yet come to light, its fundamental phonological features are known from the Median words and names which occur in Old Persian inscriptions and, less frequently, in Greek. All these features are characteristic also of Azeri and its modern relatives. Thus, there are no linguistic arguments against the derivation of Azeri from Median, which is based upon compelling geographical and historical evidence, and such a conclusion can in no way be invalidated by the fact that the phonological peculiarities of Median are found, by and large, in all northwestern branches of Iranian, including Parthian, or by the fact that it has not been possible to find exclusive Median isoglosses, referring an article I wrote at the time. This was like one sentence before I started. But His dialect research was not limited to the Azeri dialects, however. He also participated actively in the research carried out by the members of the Linguistic Atlas of Iran, which you may not know much about. Dr. Yarshater gave me the following information about this a couple of years ago. In August-September 1957, during the meeting of the 24th International Congress of Orientalists in Munich, Georg Morgensterne, the Norwegian, and Georges Redard from Bern in Switzerland took the initiative to the compilation of a linguistic atlas of Iran and also of Afghanistan. The project description as presented by Redard included the necessity and usefulness of such a linguistic atlas for lack of a synthetic work on Iranian languages and dialects, a set of principles, notably the biology and sociology of the language, and relationship between word and thing. Then form, use of questionnaires, realization, finances, proposals, proceed by stages rather than trying to do the whole thing at once, establish regional points of the questionnaires, collect all published and available unpublished material, regional atlases. A committee was formed consisting of Morgensterne, chairman, Benveniste, that's Emile Benveniste, the famous Iranist, vice chairman, Redard, secretary and the editor of the atlas, and Yarshater, vice chairman in charge of the research and operation in Iran. The committee applied to the Persian government for financial assistance, received a grant and hired 3 young researchers, 1 woman, 2 men, for traveling to designated areas to record local dialects. When Yarshater left for the United States to teach at Columbia University in September of 1958 and then for another year, he could no longer oversee the operations in Iran. The investigators were therefore put in touch with Redard, and for a while they continued to communicate with him. Redard, however, was at this time collecting data for the Linguistic Atlas of Afghanistan and lost interest in the Linguistic Atlas of Iran. The shortage of funds also created difficulties, and even though the plan continued to be nominally extant, it did not make any further progress. Only 2 articles were published containing data from the project by Redard. I forget the other one. One was on the dialectology of the date palm in Hud, and I forget what the other one was. Dr. Yarshater's material, however, has slowly been resurfacing for many years now, notably in Festschrifts and other collective volumes, as well as, and above all, in the encyclopedia itself. The material is mostly from the so-called Central Dialect Group, another medium group of Iranian dialects. He has also had assistants working on the notebooks, and if I understand correctly, all the notebooks have actually now been typed in and are available on the computer. And I hope it will be possible to publish it, and I really urge you to do that. If not all, then at least most of the material, which represents such an important part of our knowledge of Western Iranian dialects, and it would be a tragedy indeed if this material were not to be made known. I don't know if this is the same that was sent to Bern, to Redard, or whether what you sent to Redard remained in Bern. I don't know about that. I would like to know. But you can tell me about that later. So that's all I have to say. We can only stand in awe of this achievement. Thank you.
It's a great privilege and pleasure for me to be here to take part in the ceremonies paying tribute to Professor Ehsan Yarshater at 90. And my thanks go to Ahmad Ashraf for his invitation and ISIS for helping to make my attendance possible in the middle of the exam week in Cambridge. My brief is to address Professor Yarshater's contribution to the study of Persia's role within the Islamic world. His contribution to the study of pre-Islamic Iran is enormous, and Professor Hanaway will shortly speak about his work, not his work, on Persian literature, an area well represented in his extensive list of publications, ranging especially from the 15th to the 20th century. The first thing I would like to stress, therefore, is that Professor Yarshater is one of those rare few whose work and whose vision encompasses the study of Iran both before and after the advent of Islam in the 7th century, not least in the field of linguistics, and realizes first that the world did not come to an end at that point, and secondly, that Iran in the modern world is incomprehensible without a knowledge of her ancient past. Many scholars, whether by the inadequacy of their scholarly equipment or narrowness of interest, are restricted to ploughing their furrow in one field or the other. The greatest monument to Professor Yarshater's broader vision, of course, is the Encyclopedia Iranica, which provides an authoritative reference resource for the whole spectrum of Iran's history and culture, and incidentally dwarfs the Encyclopedia of Islam, now entering the lists in its 3rd edition. The tenacity, even fury, with which he pursues these goals and personally supervises the work, and you can tell here that I speak from experience, is as remarkable as it is encouraging and inspiring. Any one of these ventures would have been a lifetime's work for any normal academic. He rightly devotes considerable attention to the influence of Persia in the Middle East before the rise of Islam, so that the Muslim-Arab encounter with Persia was hardly a sudden novelty. Professor Yarshater also corrects the Arabo-centric view of Islamic history that sees decline and stagnation set in after around the 11th century. In fact, a second Persian phase of Islamic civilization then begins, at least in Iran itself. One, it is important to stress, perhaps more than the author does so, flourishing under the aegis of a succession of Turkish dynasties, reviving the tensions between Persian and Turk that had such a long pedigree and were also so remarkably productive of cultural achievement. The next severe blow came from the West, and the response to this is still being played out in ways that are both traditional and innovative. What is certain, whether one prefers to emphasize the Islamization of Iran or the Persianization of Islam, there can be no doubt that Persia's presence in the Islamic world remains both distinctive and vibrant, the engine room of political, religious, and artistic transformations that it has always been. These questions are surely a paradigm of Professor Yarshater's own presence, but are they a sign that he is suddenly feeling mortal? Surely not. We still need you and anticipate the next decade of achievement, and I therefore end in wishing you many happy returns.
Now, I've come to think that the two things closest to the heart of every Persian, whether he's or she is home on the Iranian plateau or lost in the diaspora, are their language and the literature that's been written in it for the past 1,000 years or so. I also think that of all the Persians alive today, nobody has contributed more to the knowledge and understanding of this literature than has Dr. Yarshater. I can give only the most briefest outline of his contributions to Persian literature here. Much more should be said. His contributions to literature will fall into two sections. First, his contribution to Persian literature in the narrow sense of poetry and prose. And second, his contribution to the study and the understanding of that literature. I'm not sure whether or not Professor Yarshater has written any prose fiction or poetry, but I find it hard to believe that anyone as steeped in Persian literature as he is would not have written some poetry and possibly some imaginative prose. Educated Persians from the time of Rudaki have all been expected to write poetry. Whatever the case, we'll have to wait the publication of his divan to answer this question. As to prose, I will make a short diversion here, which surely touches on the subject of literature. When I was going to Persia, often in the late 1960s and in the 1970s, I felt proud when I was told by more than one knowledgeable man that Dr. Yarshater wrote the best Persian prose of anyone writing at that time. Now, I was Dr. Yarshater's student, and I regret to say that despite his efforts, and he tried hard, I could never develop a prose style that would rise above the deplorable. However, I know it when I see it. So, now back to Dr. Yarshater. I'll begin with two small books that he wrote in the 1950s. داستان‌های شاهنامه and داستان‌های ایران باستان. The first, the title of which makes clear the contents, went into many printings in Iran and also a second edition, and won the UNESCO prize in 1959. The second, the داستان‌های ایران باستان, which retold stories from old and Middle Iranian sources, was also reprinted several times, and it won the Royal Award for the Best Book of the Year, also in 1959. These two books are written in a simple and elegant Persian and are a pleasure to read. On the more academic level, I can say that Dr. Yarshater has edited a number of Persian texts to which he contributed introductions. In addition to this sort of writing in Persian, which is quite a bit, he's contributed introductions in English to collections of conference papers on Biruni, on Sadek Hedayat, one very interesting conference called Iran Faces the 70s. And I have to say that his style of written English should be the envy of many educated native speakers. From the time of the publication of his dissertation, Dr. Yarshater's argument about the decline of poetry from the time of Shahrokh until the Bazgasht-e Adabi seemed to summarize the reasons for the general dislike among Persians of the Isfahani or Indian style of poetry, the Sabke Hindi. However, Dr. Yarshater would be the first to admit that not everybody agreed with him. Scholars such as Karim Amiri Firuzkuhi in Persia, who referred to himself as the primary standard bearer of all the partisans of Saeb and his style of expression, and Paul Losensky in the US with his welcoming Figurani, have argued very strongly in favor of Safavid and Indian style poetry. This, of course, is what one always hopes for, that your research will stimulate discussion and further research. I'll move now to what I would call Dr. Yarshater's institutional contributions to the study of Persian literature. It would begin, and we've heard something about this already, it would begin with his lead in the founding of the Bengali Tarjumeh va Nashr Kitab, the Royal Institute of Translation, in Tehran in 1954. The aim of this organization was to bring to the public well-edited texts of Persian classics of literature and history and translations of important foreign texts in similar fields. Until the foundation of the Royal Institute, there had been essentially no serious efforts made in Persia to edit texts according to the standards and using the techniques of Western scholarship. Of particular interest here is the Persian text series, which we've also heard about. And Dr. Yarshater was editor of this, as well as director of the Royal Institute. This series published historical texts, the divans of poets, early tafsirs, early dictionaries, and works of many other sorts. What was entirely new to Persian publishing was the excellent editing done in strict conformance with the highest Western standards of the day, the diligent proofreading of the texts, and the clear and elegant look of the published volumes. Each volume included a preface by Dr. Yarshater that described concisely but in sufficient detail the editorial goals and techniques employed in producing all the texts in the series. I should mention here that Dr. Yarshater founded in New York a new series of the old Persian text series from Tehran. And the first work issued in this new series was Ferdowsi Shahnameh, edited by Dr. Khalid Mutlaq. In 1957, he, along with Iraj Afshar and others, founded in Tehran the Enjumn the Book Society. Under its auspices, the important and influential monthly journal Rahnamai Kitab was published. Here one could read articles about Persian literature and language, learn of the new books published each month. Annual bibliographies of Persian printed books were published by the Book Society, which also organized exhibitions of Persian books in Tehran and abroad. In addition to managing the Royal Institute and the Book Society, Dr. Yarshater published many articles in Persian in the leading literary monthlies of Iran, such as Rahnamai Kitab, Yad Ma, Mehr, Sokhan, and the Bulletin of the Faculty of Letters of the University of Tehran. I'm probably of the last generation of English-speaking students of Persian literature that learned the basic literary styles, genres, movements, and also the basics of Persian history from the great work of E.G. Browne. His literary history of Persia was where we all first went until we learned enough Persian to read Safa. If Browne and Rivka will soon have to go into retirement, it'll be an honorable and well-earned one, and I will continue to look on them as some of my oldest and dearest friends. I now look forward to seeing on my shelf a set that I will refer to as Yarshater, as I have done with Browne, Rivka, and Safa for more years than I like to think. The last major work of Dr. Yarshater that I'll mention is, and I won't say much about this because a lot has been said about it already, of course, the Encyclopedia Iranica. In terms of literature, the coverage is almost exhaustive. Writers, poets, playwrights, genres, movements, styles, individual works, and technical aspects such as meter and rhetoric are well represented. For example, the introduction written by Dr. Yarshater to the article in Hafez, giving an overview of his poetry, is absolutely masterful, and one should read that. The editorial view of literature is as broad as one could want, in keeping with the expansiveness of the encyclopedia itself. This brief account is meant to give an idea of how Dr. Yarshater has contributed in many ways to Persian literature and the study of it. I wish him well on his 90th birthday and look forward eagerly to his forthcoming contributions.
I have been lucky in having excellent colleagues. I have been lucky in having been offered opportunities which came along not through my effort, but through chance. Chance, of course, is an important element in anybody's life. This is a book that I should recommend to all and everybody. I do not know any other book, either in Persian or in English or in French, that introduces the reader in a systematic way to Persian culture, to Persian history, to Persian religion, and all the things one needs to know as basic about Iranian world. While I was in Iran, I had become keenly aware of the lack of a comprehensive reference work that would answer all the questions about Persian culture, Persian history, Persian archaeology, Persian geography, so on and so forth. We always have aim and aiming to the best scholars on a topic, no matter where he or she was. Was she or was she in Japan, in Canada, in Turkey, or in Iran, whatever. These are in our aim, and this is what we try to keep as our aim. Thank you all for coming to this session, of which the subject was clear from the beginning, somewhat tiresome. Thank you for